So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar today. We expect this to take about an hour, albeit it will be a little bit dependent on the number of questions and the type of debate that we get going. So the purpose of the webinar today is to really unpick what's going to be in the medium-term pipeline, and recognising actually that we have obviously some disruption in the short term. I think hopefully this will give us all a little bit of light relief to look ahead to the medium term and the future pipeline of work. We've had some good signals from the government, and I think again we've got some experts on the webinar with us today that will give us their insights based on what we know from the budget, but as well adding a bit of a slant of what we've seen since then. Are the government still likely to stick with this quite ambitious infrastructure revolution? And in particular, we were focusing a bit on net zero. So we'll have two panelists. So we've got Julian Francis, who is the Director of External Affairs here at ACE. He is going to sort of give us a political view. So he will talk through what was announced at the budget, and then be able to take a forward look around what the government has said so far about investing in an infrastructure revolution. And then secondly, we have Matthew Farrow, who is our Exec Director from the Environmental Industries Commission, and he will be looking specifically at some of the complexities we have around net zero, and in particular about how it's suddenly rocketed up the importance, particularly in the planning and development phases of infrastructure projects. So we know from the judicial review on Heathrow, but actually there are going to be wider implications across any infrastructure projects that could be seen to be contradicting the net zero target. So Matthew will give us a bit of an overview on what that actually means, and hopefully help us to identify what we need to be doing and what we can be advising our clients on, actually, to help them navigate around that. So the precedent that was set and navigating around it. Realised I haven't introduced myself, so you can see me on screen. I'm Hannah Vickers. I'm the Chief Exec of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. I'll be chairing. So the format of today is we're going to have a bit of a presentation by Julian and by Matthew, just outlining where we're up to on those two topics, and then we'll take questions. So hopefully you'll be able to see on the right hand side of your screen you have the ability to type questions. So we'll do a short presentation from each of them, and then we'll have the opportunity to take questions. And again, the scope of this really is the medium term, albeit we're happy to take questions on most topics in relation to net zero and infrastructure strategy. I think let's try and use this hour as an escape from our day jobs, and an escape perhaps from coronavirus, to think about where we might be in 4 months, 6 months time. So on that basis, I think we'll kick off. If I can hand to Julian to do our first presentation.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Hello, everyone. And just waiting for the slides to come through. There we go. That is me. So that's we'll deal with the first situation that we're talking about. We are now a few weeks on from the momentous Heathrow decision that was taken by the Court of Appeal. Those ladies and gentlemen that you see sitting in front of you there, that changed everything really for people, that said that the Heathrow national policy statement was illegal and therefore had to be quashed, and we are dealing with the implications of that. So I think it's important, when we set the scene for this, to understand what the judgment was about. It was a very complex court case. There were many defendants within it, and I'm not going to go into the details of all of them, but to focus on the salient points. The court, when it handed down its judgment, was very clear in stating that this was not a judgment on Heathrow itself. This was not a investigation of the project or its worth and its value to the UK economy. The decision to proceed with a third runway at Heathrow, the court made very clear, was a political decision and was one for the government to make. The issue before them was whether the government had issued its planning policy statement around Heathrow lawfully, and whether it had complied with the own regulations of legislation that existed at the time. And it found that it hadn't, for some very specific reasons, which I will go into in the course of this presentation. So it's not the courts coming in saying that the project can't go ahead. It's not the courts coming in and saying that Heathrow is environmentally damaging per se, or that air travel is wrong in any way. It was merely saying that the government had got its own policy wrong for certain legal technical reasons. So if we then move on to the next slide, I'll talk you through. The judgment focused on two main acts. The first one was the Planning Act 2008. For those of you familiar with the Act, this sets out the powers of the government to issue those national policy statements that enable large infrastructure projects such as Heathrow to be brought forward. This is the legal basis for the government's powers on this, and this is what the court really looked at. Two issues that are key to that is, one, the power to create a national planning policy statement is embedded in that, and the court said yes, the government absolutely had the power to issue it. There were two sections of that act, however, that came up to be very important in the judgment. The first was section 5.8 that stated that then issuing a policy statement, the government must take account of its own commitment to mitigate climate change. Now, if you remember in 2008, that was set at a level of being 80% of the level it was in 1990. Which was the grounds that the government looked at when it was publishing this act. But nevertheless, it did have itself a requirement to understand how it was going to mitigate climate change. And the second section was the one following it, which was section 6.1, that requires the government to continually monitor and review any statements that it has issued to make sure that they comply with legislation that exists at the time. And this is what the basis of the argument was in Heathrow's case. They looked very clearly at the government's actions in leading up to this. So they interrogated the Davis Commission. They interrogated how the government set about reviewing the Heathrow case, how it looked at the environmental impact that Heathrow would have, how the Secretary of State announced the preferred option being the third runway at Heathrow, and then eventually how it issued in 2018 the Airport National Policy Statement. And it found that there was a flaw. And the reason for that takes us on to our next slide and the second act that existed there, which was the Climate Change Act, also passed in 2008. That set the UK on a course for significantly reducing emission standards and meeting a lower carbon threshold than it had existed. As we've already stated, that was 80% level of 1990. However, in between the passage of that act and the passage of the Airport National Policy Statement, some significant things happened. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was reached that set a much more ambitious target for carbon reduction. And although it is an international treaty and as such does not form part of domestic law, it was something that the UK government had committed itself to achieving. Then in 2018, rather swiftly, perhaps, the government amended that Climate Change Act to state that the target was no longer 80%. It was now achieving net zero by 2050, an altogether different proposition. The 80% perhaps gave some scope for industries such as aviation and transport that were heavy producers of carbon to continue, but a net zero was a whole new ballgame. And that is essentially what the court said, is that this commitment to a net zero was a new factor that the government should have taken note of under its requirements under the Planning Act to say, was the Airport National Policy Statement still fit for purpose? Did it meet the government's requirements to mitigate climate change? And if it didn't, it needed to be amended. The fact that the Secretary of State had not done that meant that the order was now illegal and had to be quashed. So That's essentially all the court said. The government hadn't followed its legal requirements under those two acts. So what are the implications of that? Well, that moves us on to the next slide, and those have been profound. It was a shock to everyone that the court has done this, but the means by which it did so opens a considerable can of worms, because the judgment goes further than just Heathrow. It is now saying to the government, every planning policy statement that is being issued for every major infrastructure project in the country, have you reviewed them? Have you looked at them in light of the new commitment of net zero, and have you changed them where necessary to put greater requirements on delivery to achieve that target? If you haven't, then potentially the statement itself is now unlawful. And this was grappled very quickly by campaigners to say this is a way to challenge major projects. So within days of Heathrow, HS2 itself was legally challenged over its environmental implications. And it wasn't the only one. The Drax power station that had an agreement to replace the coal-burning generators with gas-burning generators was already the subject of a challenge, because the government had overruled its own planning inspector on that one. But they have now added a second rider to that case, challenging it for wider climate change. Friends of the Earth came out within days of the judgment as well, saying they would challenge now all airport expansion within the UK on the grounds of Heathrow, basically saying that any airport expansion in the UK will be damaging to the environment and therefore will not meet the standards for achieving net zero, which is huge. And then within a week of the judgment, the Transport Action Network itself announced that it would be challenging the entire DfT road plan based upon its environmental impact. So this turned out to be a very, very significant judgment, one that perhaps the court hadn't quite realized, and certainly the government, I don't think, had realized the full implications of where this judgment was going to go. And that is why the government very quickly said that it was not going to appeal. And I think that was perhaps a mistake on their part within this one. But it has led to a situation where there is now existing law in the courts at a very high level that really only the Supreme Court can overturn, stating that you should be reviewing any policy statement to make sure that it meets the net zero target. So finally, what does that mean for the rest? And that brings us to our last slide, really. How do we go forward with our policies at the moment? And I think departments themselves are a little surprised by this. They recognize that they have to review all of the decisions that have been made. It's a huge job to go through. It affects everything that is underway and everything that is going to be concluded going forward, which requires a huge review. And whether they have the capacity to do that is anyone's question. We then looked at the Chancellor's budget only a few days ago, but a lot's changed in that few days since the Chancellor stood up, and he committed to the infrastructure revolution that the government has been talking about. He put some very large numbers out there to saying this would help us deliver. But when you got into the details, if you look at the Red Book, which is essentially the basis upon which that budget is designed, there are a lot of things that have been knocked down the road. So we have a comprehensive spending review. A lot of these decisions for large infrastructure projects going forward will be made at that time, and the funding will be assigned to them. We have a national infrastructure strategy that will also be delivered that will answer some of these questions. As part of that, we have a national transport strategy as well. So all these things have been pushed down through the summer and in the autumn. So we were sitting there going, well, the November budget's the one for us to watch. This is merely a marker, an intention of goodwill, but we should see what happens in November. But events have overtaken us. We now find ourselves in the midst of the coronavirus issues across the UK, with the Chancellor having now twice committed very large sums of money to dealing with the fallout from that crisis. And that leaves us with an interesting question of what capacity and inclination will there be left in the government in the summer and in the autumn when we look at the comprehensive spending review and we look at the national infrastructure strategy to continue to deliver that infrastructure revolution. That's the million-dollar question that we as an industry are facing. We have been hit on the one hand by a surprising judgment from the courts that has pushed Heathrow back, but also opened the door to a challenge to projects we all thought had been agreed and were going ahead. We now are hit with an international crisis caused by a pandemic that is affecting all global markets. And we are now saying, is there still the capacity and the drive within the government to deliver the infrastructure revolution that they committed to only a few short days ago? And that is the moving feast under which we are operating, Hannah.
Great, thank you, Julian. And that's a bit of a cliffhanger to finish on. I think we'll certainly come back to that during the Q&A session shortly. So, I mean, I think something to perhaps think about over the next sort of 10 minutes or so while we're listening to Matthew is, you know, fundamentally, this isn't going to go away. We might be slightly diverted in the short term around coronavirus, but actually, when we return to this infrastructure revolution, and given that this government, you know, is put a lot of sort of political capital into it, I think it will be only a temporary suspension while we deal with the coronavirus in the short term. We still need to understand how we're going to address this. So you might say there is a consultancy opportunity in helping clients to unpick that, but I'll pause now because we're going to hear from a real expert rather than a pretend net zero expert that I am, because I'm an engineer. Matthew Farray. So Matthew, we're very lucky to have him. He's been working on this for about 15 years, so he really is an expert and will help us myth bust a little bit of exactly what net zero is, how it relates to appraisal, and the sorts of things that perhaps we're going to need to get up to speed with, get to grips with, to help our clients over the coming months when they need to make these appraisals certainly on their major transport projects. So Matthew, would you like to take us through your slides, please?
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I'll try to follow that introduction. When Julian was explaining that the core of the judgment, the Heathrow judgment, was that the government hadn't fully taken into account its own environmental policies in its decisions. So what I want to do is focus on the sort of moving feast that is environmental policy at the moment, and cover sort of briefly three topics really. The first is the broad environmental policy trends I think we're seeing across different issues. Second, a little bit about Heathrow itself and the way aviation is perhaps a bit of a special case, I think, in net zero. And then thirdly, this vexed question of what will be the wider impacts for the infrastructure sector. So in terms of the environmental policy context as a whole, I mean, what I've found over the years is that, you know, this is a bit cyclical. And that issues rise and fall in terms of public concern and then political concern. So the sort of levels that we've been seeing in opinion polling about public concern over climate change, you know, 80% of people saying it's a major issue. We have seen that before. We saw it in sort of 2005, 6, 7, then it sort of dropped away, and obviously it's come back very strongly in the last couple of years. And you see the same with other issues, you know, air quality goes up and down and so forth. What I think is unique about the sort of current moment is that we're seeing all environmental issues get to the top of the agenda pretty much at the same time. So, you know, interesting, when the Davis Commission sort of came out, the big focus at that time was about air quality, and was Heathrow compliant with our international air quality obligations, and actually climate change was a little bit less of an issue at that point. Now we're seeing, you know, air quality, the government's putting a lot of money into that. It's had a number of legal reverses on that issue as well. Net zero, obviously we're all well aware this has become a huge issue for the government and for business. Theresa May, if you remember her, the picture up on the top left is Theresa May launching the 25-year environment plan in 2018. And believe it or not, that was the first domestic speech a Prime Minister had made just on the environment for 20 years. Tony Blair, I think, did one in 2000. So that showed that you had Michael Gove being hyperactive at DEFRA and really sort of pushing the environmental agenda forward, backed by Theresa May for the 25-year plan, and then, as Julian mentioned, very quickly before she departed, putting the net zero target onto a statutory footing. Alongside that, you've had the whole plastics agenda coming up very quickly, the emphasis on clean growth. So certainly I can't really remember a time when all environmental issues are high up the government's agenda and finding their way through things like the Environment Bill into the sort of business context. I think if we go to the next slide, the second trend I would pick out is, my feeling is in recent years there's been a bit of a harder edge, if you like, to environmental policy. And I'll give a couple of examples to illustrate that. So on air quality, where for a long time the UK, like most European countries, was nowhere near the ambient air quality directive targets, which set levels of particulates and NO2 in the air around us. And then Client Earth, I think it was, an environmental NGO, brought a court case against the government, which went to the Supreme Court in 2015, I think. And their argument was, these European directives are not optional extras. It's not enough to say, as the government was, we're doing our best, it's difficult for all countries, we're making steady progress. They argued successfully the government was simply out of compliance with an absolute European limit, which had an absolute date, 2010 in that case. They won that case, and ever since the government has been desperately trying to bring NO2 levels down. In the budget last week, I think they gave another £300 million to local authorities to try harder. The whole Clean Air Zone agenda was purely created to try to get into compliance. You look at the whole natural capital agenda, and the Environment Bill gives the Secretary of State powers, which DEFRA has said will obviously be taken up, to require all projects to, as a planning condition, to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain as a sort of absolute condition of planning permission. And then I think, as Julian was saying, the shift from an 80% reduction in carbon, which was the old Climate Change Act target, to the new target of net zero emissions by 2050 is actually quite a big change in terms of psychology and tone and sort of policy. In that, as Julian was saying, it gives sectors nowhere to hide. When we were trying to get down to 20% of the 1990 emissions, there was still quite a lot of emissions that you'd expect to be around in the economy in 2050. And so people could say, we're doing our bit, in our project, in our sector, we're getting emissions down, we're making a contribution, but we'll be taking up a bit of a share of what's left over. Under net zero, there's very little emissions left. Virtually all sectors have to be completely decarbonised by 2050. And so that really shines a spotlight on some sectors which are difficult to crack, of which, of course, aviation is one. And if we go to the next slide. So there should be a slide coming up. Yep. So I think the Heathrow decision was about sort of Heathrow specifically, although it has these wider implications. And I think aviation, not surprisingly, does have a sort of particular challenge, a particular position around the net zero debate, because obviously it is harder to decarbonise, although good progress is being made in terms of plane efficiency, and there's a lot of research going on about the use of aviation biofuels and reconfiguring airspace and so on. But nonetheless, this chart is from the Committee on Climate Change big report on net zero, which is what led Theresa May to decide it was achievable. And it shows the residual emissions, as they're called, the emissions that the committee expects still to be left in the economy by 2050 on the left, that then have to be removed, or the equivalent has to be removed by the sort of technologies on the right, in the right-hand column, to deliver this magical sort of net zero aim we're going for. And the key point here is on the left-hand side, the bottom sort of purple lilac chunk is aviation emissions. So what you can see there is that the expectation is, even with the biofuels and the plane efficiency and so forth, the expectation is the biggest chunk of emissions remaining will be aviation emissions. There are some other sectors that will have some residual emissions, but aviation is the biggest one. So I think inevitably that leads to even more scrutiny than you might have had before, I think, about is aviation, doing its fair share? Is it making every effort it can? And if you look on the right, you see how challenging it is to offset those final emissions. So a lot of it is what's called in the jargon BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So pretty much a new sort of suite of technologies. The sort of dotted line at the top shows that there are additional emissions that have to be finally removed, where at the moment it's not entirely clear how that might be done, probably by sort of direct air capture technologies and so forth. So a lot of this stuff, this removals, is being done to allow us to have an aviation economy in 2050. And I think that does mean the whole debate about Heathrow inevitably and other aviation expansion takes on a particular significance. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see what the Committee on Climate Change has said specifically to the government. So this was November 19, 2019, when Lord Deeban, as chair of the committee, wrote formally to Grant Shapps a sort of fairly lengthy letter setting out for shipping, but also for aviation, the committee's advice on what the government needed to think about in the context of net zero. So this was obviously a few weeks before the court decision, but I think was sort of gives a sense perhaps as to what was coming. And I think the two key bits in the letter that are worth sort of thinking about is, firstly, as Julian was alluding to, the committee is actually fairly clear that you can have aviation expansion in terms of demand growth expansion and still reach the sort of emissions allowed for net zero to be achieved in 2050. But what they say is their estimate at the moment is that you'd need to limit growth in demand to about 25% above current levels. And if it looks as if demand is going to outstrip that 25% sort of headroom, as you can see in the top paragraph, they're saying it's possible the government might have to start bringing in demand restraint measures. So yes to expansion up to a point, but a sort of caution to Grant Shapps that demand restraint might be needed. And then this links to the paragraph below. And I guess it sort of speaks directly to what the court was going to say a few weeks later, that the government would need to assess its airport capacity strategy in the light of that, and particularly with Heathrow being a private project, the issue about the economic viability of assets in a net zero world, and also I think quite a real sort of challenge for sort of infrastructure planning at the very end of that. So again, it makes absolutely clear a third runway is doable within the net zero economy, but there may be some difficult trade-offs between regional airports and Heathrow, and obviously that is a politically quite a challenge. Go to the next slide. What I'll sort of finish with is, so what does this mean for the rest of the infrastructure sector? And I think you can argue this both ways. So as again, as we heard from Julian, protesters have been very quick in sort of extrapolating from the Heathrow decision to what does this mean for other infrastructure sectors and other national policy statements, quite a few of which I think were sort of signed off before the Paris Agreement, or certainly before the Theresa May government established net zero as a sort of statutory target. Having said that, I guess it wouldn't be too difficult, perhaps, at a sort of high level to simply sort of amend the MPSs to say that projects that come forth within those MPSs, have to have due regard and have to be compatible with net zero. So I think it may be that the MPS issue is maybe not the central one. It's actually justifying the compatibility of projects themselves. But certainly, protesters are getting pretty skilled at doing this. So Chris Packham, with his legal challenge against HS2, as Julian mentioned, Georgia Monbiot, sort of well-known environmental campaigner, I think I'm right in saying is preparing using crowdfunding, I think, to launch a challenge against the energy MPS. I think also the other factor that you might say does mean this is big stuff for the broad environment, the broad infrastructure sector, is while net zero is in the vanguard, as I was saying at the start, there are a lot of other environmental topics which the government has been sort of winding up in the last year or so. So I would say something like environmental net gain which is sort of biodiversity net gain on steroids, if you like. It's the idea that infrastructure projects have to deliver a sort of aggregate improvement to the environment, to the natural capital they sit within, was a very clear aspiration in the 25-year environment plan, and is something I think, you know, when George Eustace has got through his current travails, he may well be interested in thinking about how we build on biodiversity net gain and put that into legislation. On the other side, I think, you know, it seems pretty clear, doesn't it, that when we do get through the immediate coronavirus crisis, the government will be desperate to jumpstart the economy and get the economy sort of stabilised and moving ahead. And what we've seen in recent years is a cross-party consensus that infrastructure has a vital role in doing that. So I would have thought there'll be real political will to make sure that, to use the cliche, sort of shovel-ready projects are not derailed by sort of further legal challenges and the sort of stuff is happening. Secondly, I think aviation is a bit of a special case, and I think the arguments about net zero and other types of infrastructure projects maybe not quite as sort of sharply focused. And then thirdly, I think something which tends to get a bit lost in the debate around this is, you know, the net zero legal commitment we have as a country is not a target for individual projects per se over their life cycle. It's a system target, if you like. It's a target for the economy as a whole in a specific year. So it's saying by 2050 and from then on, everything in the economy must together add up to a functioning sort of net zero system. And so if we go to the final slide, just to sort of bring it to a conclusion. So to my mind, what that means is particularly important is that projects can show clearly the role that they will play as part of a full net zero economy as it emerges over the next 30 years. So if you take sort of the debate around HS2, for example, you know, I think HS2 have a strong argument to say that, you know, the railway will run off electricity which has to be decarbonised in 2050. If it's not, then there's no hope of meeting net zero. And it is part of a sort of sustainable transport infrastructure to help people get around in that net zero economy. Okay, Chris Packham will then point out that some of the analysis suggests that I think only 1% of projected passengers on HS2 would have been flying if HS2 hadn't been built. But nonetheless, I think those are sort of complex arguments where I think infrastructure projects have a good opportunity to make their case. And I guess just a thought to sort of leave, which I think be interested in people's sort of thoughts and the questions. In EIC at the moment, we're doing some work with AC colleagues on net zero infrastructure. And as part of that, we're doing some analysis of the carbon chapters, which for the last couple of years, EIAs have had to include. And, you know, my hunch is that up to now, those carbon chapters haven't really been making the case strongly enough in the way they might need to in the future. And interested to hear what people sort of think about that. So I'll leave it there, Hannah.
Brilliant, thank you. Gosh, an awful lot of detail in that. Thank you both. I think we will say we can circulate these slides as well to attendees after this, and we are recording the webinar itself, so you'll be able to watch it back. I know I will need to watch it back perhaps to get into some of that detail there, Matthew, which was really, really helpful. So a gentle reminder that you can ask questions in your panel to the right. While you get typing, I'm going to take chair's prerogative, and I've got a question for each of our panelists. So we'll try and keep these brief, so we still leave some time for questions from yourselves. But first, if I can come to you, Julian, and it's a question on scope. So it's very clear description you gave around the challenge that Heathrow has seen. On a legal basis, are there mechanisms to challenge across the piece? So we know clearly this has set a precedent for challenging, or a legal challenge around large projects that have an NPS. But what about something like a local authority road scheme? Are there legal mechanisms that all of those projects, regardless of size, could start to become challenged, you know, on the same lines, for setting the same precedent?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. That's an excellent question, and it's a brave lawyer who tells you there are no grounds for contesting anything. Yes, they are potentially challengeable as well. we must remember that outside of the UK government, all bodies in the UK, whether they be national governments or local governments, are subsidiary bodies, and they must comply with UK law that has jurisdiction within the areas in which they operate. So yes, local authorities are very much an organ of the government. They must meet the same requirements as government departments or any other government agency as well. And so local authorities must be looking towards that. Something we have noticed in passing, it's not really something we've drilled into yet, but I think it's something that it requires us to do so if this carries on, is that a lot of local authorities are making pledges to bring forward net zero to much earlier times than 2050. Some have said 2040, some have said 2030. And that's all very well and good for them to do so. They can pass motions towards that in their own chambers, but how do they achieve it? Those staff members and officers who are tasked with dealing with it have no idea. They don't even know what the carbon implications are for the local authority and what they deliver, because essentially politicians have looked at it and said, okay, that's fine, we're a local councillor, we can say we need to achieve net zero by 2030, that sits in our base, but the problem is not really ours. That's for national government to figure out how we transport things and how we actually power things and so on, so we can feel good about ourselves. But the problem is that local authorities themselves do deliver a huge number of services, and now those services have to meet the motions that the councils have put of achieving those targets in much earlier timeframes. And they have created by that motion a legally challengeable mechanism by which local residents may well come forward and start challenging their own action. So yes, the Heathrow judgment does give us a very wide scope.
Okay, so we think that there is potential then for that to be set as a precedent.
Yeah.
Right. Matthew, a quick question for yourself. You sort of alluded to it, but I'm putting myself in the shoes of a consultant who will be currently working with clients on projects in the development phase, perhaps doing business cases. You sort of touched a little bit on, through the planning process, you might use the EIA as the mechanism to conduct this appraisal, but really, what is there out there already around guidance? How would you structure an appraisal? How do you even bound an appraisal on a major infrastructure project to consider all of the things that you would need to demonstrate to get it over the line? What would the part of the business case look like, and how would you approach it?
Yeah, I think part of the trouble is there isn't a lot of guidance around at the moment on how you do this. So with the EIA carbon chapters, I think IEMA, the professional body, did a little bit of guidance, but it was pretty high level. And some of the carbon chapters I've looked at for things like road schemes and so on, you just have some numbers where it says the embedded carbon, the construction carbon, and the operational carbon over 20 years of this road scheme is so many 1,000 tons of carbon. This is less than 0.01% of total UK emissions, therefore it's deemed not significant. And I think that, there has been a sort of view that if you had some numbers in and you could sort of argue the overall total wasn't too significant, that was sufficient. I think this is what's going to change, and I think we do need some better guidance about exactly the right way to do that. I mean, there's a PAS standard which I think helps a little bit, and one of the outputs of the joint EICAC work on net zero, I'm thinking maybe to help with others to develop that guidance. But I think the key thing would be to understand how the asset that you're creating is going to fit into the wider sort of infrastructure network in 2050. If we're looking ahead to then as a net zero sort of key target date. And look at how it helps other people live low carbon lifestyles, but also the amount of emissions it might use in terms of gas use, which has to be virtually zero. Is it future proofed? So could it be switched to a hydrogen network system if it was a building needed heating, for example? And I think we're going to see a focus on that sort of future proofing, as well as just sort of raw numbers in terms of the amount of construction carbon and so on.
Thank you, Matthew. We've got a couple of questions come in, so thank you very much, and keep them coming. So we've got a little bit more time. A sort of follow-up question, Matthew, that we've had from some of our attendees would be around how will this affect the construction phase of projects? So, for example, the carbon footprint of concrete and the plant that you use to construct it. I mean, perhaps, you know, how influential is that versus the sort of whole life carbon of the asset in use typically?
Yeah, so I guess the way to think about it is there are sort of three types of carbon, you know, you get with any infrastructure project. You get the embedded carbon, so the carbon that was used to create the products, you know, the concrete or whatever it is to actually make the project. You get the construction carbon, so the emissions used in the machinery, the vehicles and so forth, and plants and generators when construction phase is going on. And then you get the operational carbon, which can either be from the asset itself, or it could be, you know, as in Heathrow, primarily from the users of the asset. For the sort of the core 2050 target, what you're really talking about, assuming the asset is created and in use by 2050, you're talking about that operational carbon in 2050 and beyond. But I think where the construction carbon and the embedded carbon comes in is partly obviously in terms of, you know, best practice, doing the right thing. You know, for many years now in the infrastructure sector, we've all worked hard to reduce construction carbon, embedded carbon, and there's a Green Construction Board and many initiatives and companies doing good stuff to do that. I think where it bites in policy terms is when the Climate Change Act was passed, Parliament, you know, I think wisely recognised that there's no point just having a long-term goal without some mechanism to try and force action in the early phases. So the Climate Change Act created a system of carbon budgets, which are sort of the total amount of carbon that the UK can emit over each 5-year sort of period. And basically, it's the Committee on Climate Change's job to advise Parliament and Government on setting those budgets 10 years out, pretty much. And what they'll be doing is, now we have the 2050 net zero target, they'll be tightening those forward carbon budgets to put the UK on a steeper downward trajectory year by year, so we get to where we need to be in 2050. And that's going to create some challenges, I think, for, you know, industrial plants who are making construction projects for construction emissions themselves. And so it is going to be vital, I think, that projects can demonstrate they're doing what they can to reduce embedded carbon and construction carbon. I say partly just to show, you know, stakeholders they are doing everything they can to do that anyway, but also to make sure that, you know, the sectors and the economy as a whole can keep within these nationally binding carbon budgets.
Okay, thank you. That's very thorough. I hope everybody was taking notes there, so you're able to go and offer your clients your help and your expertise in that. I've got a couple more questions. So actually one that I'm going to answer myself, so I shall ask the question, which is net zero is a terrific ambition, but the individual government departments' funding rules do not yet accommodate net zero. Are you aware of plans for government to align funding and investment with net zero? So I shall pick that one up. Look into my crystal ball. If I was sitting in Treasury, which in a previous life I did, I suspect this will come as part of the spending review, certainly for government departments, as a condition on the funding. It'll be interesting to see exactly how that is worded, but I suspect every funding settlement and every government department will have some sort of net zero target attached to it. Now, whether they are at a level where it's sophisticated enough to actually give a sort of tangible target, or whether it is, you know, a condition that when the programmes come forward for business case approval from the government departments, at that point they have to demonstrate how they are meeting the net zero target. So I think we'll see some conditionality coming into the funding that government gives out to the arm's length bodies, and then following on from that, I think we will see this establishment of the business case appraisal guidance, and potentially the you know, updates to the green book and things which start to recognise this as a sort of stop-go in terms of approval of government projects. So we would need to be able to demonstrate that. So thank you for that question, Stephen. Right. I have another question now around how you actually measure this, and I think a really good practical question. So Each of the initiatives that this particular person has seen, such as Network Rail's zero traction policy, assumes that all other parts of the industry will achieve net zero status by 2050 as part of their calculations. Isn't this building a house of cards? Very provocative question, but I wonder, Matthew, in terms of appraisal methodologies, obviously you've been on this and in the detail for a longer than quite a number of us. You know, do you think there is a pragmatic way to be able to assess this? And how far are we along the road of actually being able to create that and make it meaningful rather than, as you say, perhaps a house of cards and another tick box exercise?
Yeah, I think it is very difficult. I think whenever I've tried to build houses of cards, they always topple over pretty quickly. And I think, building a net zero economy is extremely challenging. And there's no sort of getting around that. It involves a lot of different things happening across a lot of different parts of the economy over a pretty tight timescale, certainly when we're talking about infrastructure, and in a way which does sort of cohere. So I think at one level it is right and sensible for people when they're sort of doing their bits of the infrastructure world and their projects to make some assumptions and to recognise that getting to net zero is dependent not just on what they do, but is dependent on what other parts of the economy are doing. What they have to do, though, is be able to demonstrate that they're not using that as an excuse not to do what they can themselves. And I say, I think this is a big shift in mindset away from the sort of 80% reduction target, which maybe allowed a little bit of that thinking in terms of how projects were appraised to net zero, when you're allowed almost no emissions from almost any part of the economy. But where it's particularly challenging is where the Committee on Climate Change has set out some reasonably sort of detailed scenarios about how different things will be deployed and the progress we need to make in decarbonising electricity and so forth. But there are some choices around this, and I guess one of the ones that's talked about most is with heating, where you can either electrify most heating on the basis the electricity is all from renewables and nuclear, or you could go for a sort of more hydrogen economy and have hydrogen boilers and hydrogen networks and so forth. And at the moment, no one knows which direction we'll go in. No one knows whether you'd have to do one solution really or one approach for the country as a whole, or whether you might say the northwest, where there's a lot of interest in the hydrogen economy at the moment, could maybe more go down that path, and maybe the southeast of the country would go more for electricity. So I think the challenge for those projects is to show that they are compatible with those scenarios, and have thought this through, so they have an answer to, you can't have any gas boilers beyond 2030 or whatever. What is your solution for the buildings in your asset? Is it to get them ready for electricity, or is it to get them ready for hydrogen, or do you have some way to be future-proofed and ready for both? And I think that's what we're going to see people being asked to do. But because that's got a new way of appraising projects, I think we're all trying to work out what that will mean in practice.
Okay, so interesting. So there is some existing best practice, but yeah, definitely an opportunity for a more pragmatic approach to be developed, perhaps, and maybe something that, as you say, we can work with our members on, trying to feed that into government. Right. So just conscious of time, I've got a couple of last questions, if we can keep it short in our answers. Sort of follow on to that, Matthew, around some comment on carbon chapters in the EIA. So this person says in their experience they've not really addressed a net zero pathway, and that may be largely a symptom of a wider issue, that the EIA and strategic environmental assessment are processes to follow to disclose and try to reduce impacts. So they think they need some rethinking and upgrading to reflect the harder edge and more absolute tangible requirements. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, already I think there've been a developing sort of view that EIAs were maybe becoming not fit for purpose for big projects. They're often enormous documents with hundreds and hundreds of pages of detail, where people try and cover every possible sort of impact, and a lot of people feel they're not very useful in terms of making good policy, making good judgments. So I think there's a question about the sort of structure of EIAs and the way they are sort of manifested. But I think on the carbon specifically, yeah, the net zero target is a shift, and I think we're going to need to see carbon chapters explicitly looking at the impact of the net zero target on the project.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Right, Julian, a question for you about responsibilities. So this is quite interesting. So this person asks, who is ultimately responsible for international aviation? Obviously, airports facilitate greater use by expanding, but the airlines and the private companies are the ones burning the fuel. So how can airports be responsible for emissions that they don't control? Isn't this the government's job? So where does it actually sit from a legal perspective around the net zero law?
Yes, the questioner has focused on the catch-22 for Heathrow. So Heathrow can obviously control the emissions of the airport itself, the asset it owns, but it can't control the emissions of the vehicles that use the airport as a function. The short answer to who is responsible for that is the international community. Aviation is controlled by international treaties, some of them stretching back to just after the Second World War, when the aviation industry was developed. It is also a fact of life that there are two primary manufacturers of airline in the world, not exclusively, but they are primarily Airbus and they are Boeing. So you're going to need the EU and the United States itself to be signatories to those agreements. Then you also have the countries that produce the engines themselves. A lot of them are both within those jurisdictions, but there are places in China and Russia that are outside of that. So you will need an international treaty to determine the emission standards of airlines, because at the moment the airline manufacturers are producing their product to meet those international sales standards, so that those planes can be sold and used anywhere in the world. So government does have an obligation there. The UK government could and should probably be working with its partners to create a new international treaty on driving down those standards within airlines, but it can do things domestically. The government can tax planes, for instance, that use its airspace that are excessively polluting, so that that will encourage airline fleets to modernize their planes to lower the costs of operating within airspace. But don't forget, the government will have to balance that with the fact that every time it raises the cost of using UK airspace and UK airports, it drives competition to other places, particularly main European hub airports. And so if the UK wishes to maintain itself as a globally connected economy, it's going to have to balance that, which is why the international treaty obligation is the route that is probably the best to go down, but it is a very slow process. What we do hope is that many of those countries will sign up to the international agreements on climate change, which would make it easier. But there will be considerable pushback from industries to delivering that standard.
If I can just add to that, Hannah, there's so I think there's a sort of a policy dimension to that, and there's a sort of how you actually measure this stuff dimension to it. So I think I'm right in saying that in sort of carbon accounting terms, so working out how many emissions there are and who's, under whose budget, as it were, they're put. The way it's done is that the UK is responsible, or the emissions from flights that depart from the UK, but not the ones that land in the UK, are put against our sort of national carbon account, as it were. And I think the technical way they do that is they actually look at bunker fuel that's used in the UK for aviation. So that's a sort of rough and ready way they work it out. But I think then, as Julian says, in policy terms, you've got sort of two sides to it. So obviously the UK can, influence demand for aviation within the UK through, frequent flyer taxes or airport policy, whatever it wants to do. But obviously it only makes sense to be doing that if that's part of the global effort that Julian talked about. And we started this talking about the Paris Agreement and the impact on the Heathrow decision. And of course, the Paris Agreement is just that. It's an attempt to start to create the right global framework where everyone does their bit. And obviously, if we get to a position where other countries aren't playing their part, then there's a debate to be had about the value of the UK pushing ahead.
So very interesting, very complex picture, right? So I'm just going to draw the questions to close there. I think really interesting. So thank you very much to both of our panelists, and thank you to all of our well-informed questioners on the line watching. If I were to sort of summarise that, I'd say the takeaways are, I mean, it's clearly still quite an uncertain and evolving area. If you're an optimist, you look at that as an opportunity for consultancy. So I definitely think here that actually there is a huge opportunity for us to help our clients, and be that whether it's getting a better handle on embedded carbon that you're designing into the projects that you're working on, thinking a bit more about how they're actually constructed. So starting to really get into the detail of being able to understand carbon within your project you're working on, because I think it's become increasingly valuable to the clients to be able to articulate that, to measure that. So I'd suggest that is an area. And then perhaps in a sort of advisory strategic consultant perspective, thinking about or starting to think about the methodologies we could apply and how you would conduct the appraisal on a major project perhaps that demonstrates that. So what, again, if you were say perhaps talking to Heathrow about this at the moment, what advice, what modelling could you offer them around helping them decide their approach to net zero? You know, can we actually start to model, almost transport model for them, the impact of taxing airlines and start to give them, you know, ideas and different options that they could then pick that we would put into the appraisal, in the same way we perhaps do at the moment with a layout, with a sort of physical asset. How can we model carbon in the same way? So really interesting discussion. Like I said, probably quite a bit of work to do towards the second half of this year on it, and I do think it's not going to be something that goes away in a hurry. So maybe if we've got some downtime over the next few weeks, an area for us to really start to think about as an industry how we can come out strong and add value to our clients for it going forward. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Like I said, this will be available online if you wanted to watch it back or share with your friends. And I look forward to seeing you on our webinars in future. Take care all. Bye.